Okay, I guess we'll get started. It's that time anyways. So thanks so much for coming, and I have to confess I'm a little bit nervous because I'm a little bit out of my element with this session. No pun intended, maybe you'll get later. Largely because I am a chemist in terms of my field of study, with some biology as well. And things that we'll be talking about today or tonight actually span a variety of different topics. And so I've had to really kind of stretch myself in terms of what I was going to dig into a little bit. So yeah, I'll just confess that right from the beginning. So it means that there's a good chance that I may make some mistakes along the way. And if I do, and you know better, then please talk to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to hear your input on anything that we talk about tonight. So, if you can recall, for those of you that were here, last session we looked at one of the prevailing dogmas of the scientific community, which was the theory of evolution. And I certainly wasn't comprehensive in my approach. I tried to be representative. I tried to just pick a few key things from the strongest arguments that are put forward for the theory of evolution. And so hopefully that what was taken away from that session was that there are really kind of two different ideas when the word evolution is tossed out there. There's this idea of microevolution versus macro. And micro, there seems to be some merit to it in terms of what the evidence suggests, but macro, not so much. And so if you're not sure what those terms mean, because maybe you were absent last time, or it was 2 weeks ago, then please talk to me afterwards. But it's not really my focus of tonight. So my goal for tonight will be to look at some of the evidence for the age of the universe and ultimately the age of the Earth. And so in the same way that I did with the theory of evolution, I hope to kind of lay the groundwork first. So there'll be a little bit of, I guess, teaching that will happen. And then we'll kind of get into some of those examples that we can talk about in light of the foundation. And so at the very end of my session, I will kind of get a little bit more broad and kind of answer the question. I was asked this question actually after the very first session, which was, why does any of this stuff matter? Why does it matter to our faith? Or does it matter to our faith? And so I will try to answer that at the end. That will kind of be my conclusion. At least to the best of my ability, I will. So I will be kind of doing a couple things. First, like I said, I'll be looking into what are the different ideas about the age of the Earth. So we're looking at, there's secular ideas about the age, but there's also competing Christian ideas about the age of the Earth. And then we'll kind of dig into some of the underlying assumptions. So those will be kind of where I'm going to start tonight. Now, I do want to just point out that this is really kind of where I'm coming from tonight, which is that there's really two possibilities in terms of the age of the Earth. These are two dogmas, really, if you can remember the first session. These are two ideas that are out there that are held strongly on the basis of evidence, I believe, for both of these. And so the first position is that the Earth is old. That it is, in fact, very old. It is 4.5 to 5 billion years old. That is the idea, that's one of the dogmas that's put out there for the Earth, the age of the Earth. And the universe is even older, according to this theory, which is that the universe is about 14 billion years old, so substantially older than the Earth. And then competing with that is another dogma, which is that the Earth is young, and quite young, comparatively. In fact, it's 6,000 to 7,000 years old. That is the idea, although I've seen some estimates that stretch that to within even 10,000 years. Although most scientists that would hold to a young Earth position would likely land in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 years. Now, one thing that maybe is obvious when you look at these two ideas here is that they're very different. Extremely different. You have one that's in the realm of thousands, and you have one that's in the realm of billions. And so what happens when you have two ideas that are put forward like this, and when they're very, very different, it can lead to conflict. Because what happens is you have people that hold to each of these positions, and they create, they hold to it dogmatically, and what it does is it leads to putting down the other position. And so, for example, somebody that might hold to an old earth would actually argue that the evidence is overwhelming in favor of an old earth. And because it's overwhelming, if you hold to a young earth, then you must be just plain stupid. Or you're just ignoring the scientific evidence and just firmly holding to an outdated idea. That would be maybe what is suggested from somebody that holds to an old earth position. I'm giving the worst case scenario here. And so perhaps somebody that holds to a young earth position may suggest that if there is a Christian that holds to an old earth, well, what they must be doing then is just ignoring the plain teachings of the Bible and rejecting what God's Word has to say. And so those are pretty strong statements, I think, on both sides that are put forward. I didn't just make them up off the top of my head. I have encountered these both in conversation, but also in writing, in literature, quite often, that these two perspectives are kind of put forward from this angle. And so it kind of leads to some people becoming angry. And my goal tonight, I will ultimately tell you in terms of where I land, and I might as well tell you now. I tend to hold to a young earth dogma. That's where I land in this debate. However, I don't hold to it in a way that I'm not open to hearing what somebody else would have to say about it. In fact, this is a danger that is very real, and I understand has happened even within this congregation, that there's been some conflict over this issue. And yeah, I understand that there's strongly held ideas, but the reality of the situation is, especially when it comes to scientific evidence, it's all fitting into that historic category. If you can recall my first session, there's kind of two different types of science. There's observational science, which is the ones that you can test. And you can test them, and you can run an experiment, and you can test it again and again and again. And you can check to see whether the results match. But with historical science, you're limited. You can't do that. And so regardless as to whether we hold to an old or a young earth, we cannot test our hypothesis, at least not effectively. And so that puts everybody at the same disadvantage right from the get-go. So, to answer this question, which is a question that I have encountered before, can somebody be a Christian and believe the earth is old? And by old, I mean the billions of years. The answer absolutely has to be yes. It has to be. Because our definition of Christian hopefully doesn't necessarily lay out what we need to believe about the age of the earth. In fact, it really just has to do with Christ and what he did for us. And so I just want to put that out there right now. Although I will be arguing that the earth is young, I do not in any way doubt the salvation of somebody like Hugh Ross, who is a man that I'll be explaining his position in a couple minutes here. He believes that the earth is old, and he is probably smarter than I am. In fact, I can almost guarantee that. And he also, I believe, has a very strong faith. And so I respect that. And so I thought I needed to address that tonight. Now, yes, sorry, I forgot that I had tossed this in there. This is one of those last minute additions. Before I jump in too far into the actual theories here or into the actual evidence, I suppose I felt like I needed to address this verse and another verse that is similar, which you can see right there. But I'll go back to this one here. Because this, in 2 Peter 3:8, it says, "But you must not forget this one thing, dear friends. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day." And I just want to deal with this one right off the beginning here, because I have heard this verse used to describe that the earth is old. That because Genesis uses the word day, and we know that a day is like 1,000 years with the Lord, that the term day is redefined by this passage. But it needs to be pointed out that this passage really has nothing to do with creation. In fact, if you were to read the rest of 2 Peter chapter 3, which I will actually put up another passage later on, you would see it's actually looking ahead. It's not looking back. It's looking at the second coming of Jesus. and is talking about this idea that God exists outside of time, and so if we're impatient for Christ to return, it's because of this. And so we can only live in our understanding of time. That doesn't limit God in any way. This is another passage that's essentially saying the same thing, but a totally different context this time. This is not talking about the second coming of Jesus. It's actually it's actually poetic in this instance. Without getting too technical, I had to figure this out. I had to read a whole bunch of stuff to find what this was actually talking about here. And you can see it's poetry because it follows a certain pattern where it describes 1,000 years are as a passing day, and then as brief as a few night hours. So it's kind of like, okay, there's two different ideas here, and they both. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but apparently this is a poetic structure where it says something and then it repeats it, but it's a decreasing pattern. It's getting smaller. You can see it starts a day and then goes down to a few hours, whatever. The point is, this is poetry. And so we cannot use poetry to interpret Genesis, which is not poetry. Okay, and so we can't do that. And so this verse is kind of out. And really, those are it. Those are the only two verses that I've heard put forward kind of in this vein. So let's get to what does Genesis actually say, because I feel like we have to talk about this before we can move on and get into the scientific evidence. There's a whole lot of controversy out there. I have found tons of resources on both sides of this debate, and it really comes down to one simple Hebrew word, which is yom, Y-O-M. You can see it up there. And so this word yom has a variety of different definitions in the Bible. And so we have to kind of think about what does it mean every time it is translated. Now, we don't actually have to think about that too much because the people that translated the Bible in the various different translations have already done that thinking for us. However, this is where the controversy comes from. Whenever yom is found, it actually has 5 possible different meanings. Now, 3 of them are up on the screen. It can mean 12 hours, loosely the daylight portion. You know, it's an average of 12 hours. It could mean 24 hours, or it could mean a period of time that is unspecified, but it's a finite amount. And so those are kind of the 3 definitions that kind of fit into the controversy. I think on the handout I gave you all 5. And the other 2, the 2 at the bottom, are really not relevant to this whole debate. So, this is the passage, this is the very first passage that we actually find the controversy in. Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. It says, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. So you maybe notice that there's 2 days in there. Those are both the same word. They're both yom in the Hebrew. Sorry. And you can argue that they don't mean the same thing. So actually that hardly shows up at all, but I highlighted the first one yellow. It doesn't to me. So the first reference today is yellow, and the second one is red. Now the first one up there on the screen, largely nobody disagrees about. This is one where if you read it, it actually talks about God called the light day, darkness he called night. This is the kind of that 12-hour thing, right? It's the daylight portion of a 24-hour period. And so on average it's 12 hours. And so actually most people agree that that's the correct usage of the word yom in that passage right up there at the top. It's down here where people start disagreeing. Because it says, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And this pattern repeats itself over and over and over again through Genesis. There is something special about this first usage here, but I'm not about to get into that because, like I said, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. However, this is the controversy, because there are those that say that this word right here is referring to 24 hours. And there are those that say that this word right here is referring to a vast amount of time that's finite. Who knows? It's not specified. And so those are both valid definitions for the word yom. They both are valid, except perhaps not in this context. And so that is really where I want to kind of point out who are the different people involved here. So which one is it? Is it 24 hours, or is it a long period of time that Genesis is talking about? There's ministries like Creation Ministries, Answers in Genesis, and John Lennox, who actually, incidentally, believes that the earth is billions of years old. However, he says that Yom most definitely is 24 hours in this interpretation and in all the other ones of Genesis as well. And then you have those that hold to a long period of time. Hugh Ross, as part of Reasons to Believe ministry, and so all the various scientists that work for him hold to that it's a long period of time. And then another one called Biologos. They also say that it's to be interpreted as a long period of time. And so it can be confusing. So the best way, the simplest way that I'm going to try to answer this today, just to give you a feel for why I hold to that it's 24 hours, because I do. I just to give you an example here of a completely different passage. So this is just a paragraph that's a sentence actually that's made up to make a point. So in my father's day, this is actually on your sheet, I believe. In my father's day, he would go to bed early Sunday evening and rise early in the morning of the following day and spend the next 6 days traveling during the day to cross the whole country. And so you can see there's lots of usage of the word day here. Now this is English, of course, but you can see I've highlighted them all there. Hopefully that's visible to you. And you can perhaps just by reading that, tell that they can mean different things. Even in English, the word day has different interpretations. So up here, in my father's day, is that talking about 24 hours? No. It's talking about some sort of time in the past, a specific time in the past, whenever it was. Now we have another one here. It says he would go to bed early Sunday evening, rise early in the morning of the following day. What's that? Is it 24 hours? Just say yes or no. Yes. What is the clue in the context here? That's right. You have evening and you have morning the following day. So that tells us that it is 24 hours. And spend the next 6 days traveling. Is that talking about 24-hour the day there? Yes, it is. How do we know? There you go. Because I heard somebody say it. Because there's a number in front. Okay, when you see a number in front, it tells you that it means 24 hours. Traveling during the day. Now, is that 24 hours? So what's that? That's that daylight period, right? Which is around 12 hours, I guess, if you live right on the equator. And so you can see kind of the different interpretations of day. That's the problem in the biblical text as well, is that there are these different interpretations. Now, I think, and I've confirmed this through a bunch of different research, that the Genesis text is talking about 24 hours, largely because in the passages it says first day, second day, third day, fourth day, etc., etc., etc. Now I did say there's something special about that first one because it actually says, if you translate it literally, it doesn't say the first day, it says day one, and then it says the second day, the third day, whatever. Now I don't want to get too technical here, however, what it turns out, and I dug into this a little bit, is if you look in, the word yom is used 2,300 times in the Old Testament. It is also used in other ancient Hebrew texts. And every single time, without exception, when there is a number in front, it always refers to 24 hours. Every single time. There are 0 exceptions to that rule. The only time I've ever found written down that there's an exception to that rule is when somebody was saying that the exception to the rule is in Genesis. Because it is. And there was no explanation given. And so, not just using the Bible, the 2,300 different references, but also other ancient Hebrew texts, every single time you see the word Yom, the number in front, it always means 24 hours. And I don't see why in this context it should be changed. So that is my standpoint. I have other information, but I'm not going to go there in terms of that, because this is not a Hebrew class. So that's that in terms terms of what I believe Yom to mean. Now, the question is, what's the motivation then? Why is it that you have some scientists who are saying, and Hebrew scholars even, that are saying that Yom means more than 24 hours, it means a vast period of time? And then why do you have others that do not? I would suggest that it comes down to this. Now, I have to say this before I say this next part. I have actually had the privilege of actually listening to Hugh Ross speak. He's a scientist, he's an astronomer actually, speak on a couple different occasions. He came to my school, to my university, and I sat in on 3 sessions of his, and then he also came and spoke at a chapel one day of the week as well. So I've heard him speak several times on this, and he holds to the idea that when it says Yom, it's referring to billions of years perhaps, or at least a finite amount of time each time that it's said. However, one of those times when I heard him speak, he told his testimony. And I have to tell you, when I heard him speak, I was a very new Christian, very new. And also a very new science student at the time. Something didn't sit right with me when I heard him speak, but I had no idea what it was. It wasn't until later on when I started investigating that I figured it out, what it was that bothered me about his stance. When he tells his testimony, he came to Christ right around the same age that I did, actually, around 16 or 17 years old. However, he was, like I said, smarter than I am, and he had already started investigating some pretty major scientific theories, such as the Big Bang. So he had already investigated the Big Bang, and he had already committed himself to the idea that the Big Bang is true. That it happened exactly the way that scientists say it happened. And from that starting point, he then started researching he actually researched several different faiths, and came to the conclusion that the Bible is the only perfectly consistent scripture that exists in all the different faiths. To me, though, the flaw is this. It comes down to this. I believe that what he did, this was before he spoke with any Hebrew scholars even, before he even spoke with other scientists, I believe that what he did was he reinterpreted the scripture to mean what he wanted it to mean in light of his understanding of the Big Bang. Right from the get-go, he'll tell you that testimony, that he first was convinced of the truth of the Big Bang, and then came to the scriptures. And so what happened was he reinterpreted what Yom meant based on science, based on his firm belief that the universe is 14 billion years old. And to me, this is the approach that we should be using. Scripture should be used to reinterpret everything in our lives. And if we ever encounter something that seems to contradict the scriptures, then it is entirely appropriate, based upon our worldview, based upon my worldview, to reject that thing that seems to contradict. Investigate it further, find out what else is there, find out the underlying assumptions into it, which I will help you with tonight with some of them. And then, it is entirely consistent to reject it. Hugh Ross didn't do that. Now, I respect him as a scientist. I go to his website all the time. I use it for resources even. I just don't agree with his stance on science and scripture. Okay, so that's where I will leave that idea. Now, there are actually 3 views, and I'm going to put this to rest very shortly here. There are actually 3 views in terms of the age of the earth. There's the younger view, which Jonathan Sarfati is a PhD scientist. He's actually a biochemist, and he works for CMI. He actually helped found it in the United States, I believe. And then there's the day-age theory, which is that Yom means billions of years, or at least a large amount of time. And that's Hugh Ross' reasons to believe in biologos, although I didn't include them because there's many other things in their stance that I do not agree with. And then there's the date gap, which is this weird compromise that John Lennox has come up with. He understands the biblical text only teaches 24 hours in terms of Genesis. However, he believes the earth is old. So what he suggests is that there's the day, and then there's a gap. And then there's the next day, and then there's a gap. And then there's the next day. But God did his supernatural creative work in each period of 24 hours, followed by a gap. That's John Lennox's perspective. And I respect him very much as well, largely because he is the only Christian that I have ever seen go head-to-head with Richard Dawkins and really put Dawkins back. Dawkins was almost ready to concede some points in the debate there. And so that's that's unique in terms of his ability to debate with somebody like that. All right, let's get into some of the science now. Now, I've by no means comprehensively discussed the issue of yom and days and 24 hours versus billions of years. There are other points to be made. I'm just not going to. And so if you want to talk more, feel free to talk with me afterwards. I would be happy to talk about that. Now, there are two underlying assumptions that actually go into why scientists say today that the Earth is billions of years old. The first one is the universe. It is believed that the universe is 14 billion years old. I talked about this first session, Big Bang Theory. I'm going to investigate it just a tiny bit more this time around, and I mean it, just a tiny bit more. Now, there were three evidences for the Big Bang Theory. Number one was this thing called redshift. Now, redshift, if you can remember, actually I didn't even write the words up there. It has to do, oh yes it did. No, it didn't. It has to do with the change in frequency when something's in motion. Now here it is in sound again. So that's a familiar phenomenon for some of you, that you've heard that change that occurs when something's in motion. You learn, nowadays students learn about that in grade 11 physics. However, light does the same thing. The only thing is our eyes can't detect it. However, scientific instrumentation can. And so we understand, when we look out into the universe, we understand that what seems to be the case is everything around us is moving away. So everything's not staying still, because when they say it's moving away because the frequencies are not staying constant, they're actually shifting to red, which is that whole change, just like we heard with the car horn there. Now, one of the key players in terms of establishing the Big Bang from an astronomical perspective was Edwin Hubble. He wasn't the main guy that discovered redshift, but he certainly had a lot to do with it. And this is what he had to say. You can see this quote here. I don't know if I put this on your page or not, so I'll read it out. He said, "Such a condition," so referring to the redshifts, "would imply that we occupy a unique position in the universe. But the unwelcome supposition of a favored position must be avoided at all costs." What he's saying, and what other astronomers discovered at the time, was not only did it seem like everything's in motion, it seemed like everything's in motion with us at the center. Why would that be an unwelcome idea? Because that would suggest that we are special in some way. That we are not just this random solar system off in the tiny side of a random galaxy, off in this tiny side of a random galactic cluster, that we are actually at the center of it all. That's what was discovered back here with the redshift. So because this was an unwelcome position, this idea popped up after redshift was discovered. It's called the cosmological principle, or the Copernican principle. Remember, Copernicus was the guy that first suggested that the Earth is not in the center of the solar system. So that's why it's named after him. And so here's what it says. The principle itself might not mean anything to you, but it says, viewed on a sufficiently large scale, the properties of the universe are the same for all observers. What this is saying is that no matter where you look from, you would see the same thing. So what this does is it gets rid of the idea that we're special, and it says if we were way off in some other solar system, in some other galaxy, we would see the same thing. The problem with this principle is there's absolutely zero evidence for it. It's a philosophical statement to try to remove us as being important. It really is. Now I know you can only just take my word for that, but if you were to look up the proof for the cosmological principle, there aren't any. It's a statement to try to remove us from the center of the universe. So, here's the next one. This is the second evidence. Remember, the theory is that there was an explosion at some point in time, in fact 14 billion years ago, and this explosion set everything in motion. That's where the expansion came from. And because there was an explosion, there's this leftover energy. And this leftover energy is everywhere. In fact, they discovered it by accident just by they were trying to look out into space at other things, and they kept picking up all this interference. And this interference, it turned out, was absolutely the same everywhere they looked. And so because it was the same everywhere they looked, they said, aha, do you see? The cosmological principle is correct. It's the same everywhere. We predicted that it would be this way, and it actually is. The problem is, recently, as our technology has improved, they've started to discover that the CMB, cosmic microwave background radiation, is not the same everywhere. In fact, it's doing some very bizarre things from a secular perspective. What it appears is that when they look out into the universe right now, this cosmic microwave background radiation actually appears to be orbiting us. It appears that we are in the center after all, and this completely is throwing astronomers for a loop, because it flies in the face of the Big Bang Theory and the cosmological principle. And so what I would suggest, the reason why I'm showing you these quotes, which you can see up there, is that the Big Bang Theory is actually on quite shaky territory because of this discovery. Now, am I confident that they will come up with an explanation for why it's doing this? Yes, I am. I am confident that they will come up with a secular explanation to explain why this doesn't contradict the cosmological principle. However, currently, as is, it does. And this is quite hard to find, actually. It's quite difficult to find this information, but you can. I found it, and so you can too if you like. So, just to kind of come back to this one, because this one I hinted at in the first session, is the idea that they use to figure out the age. Because of these percentages, this is how they do some sort of backwards calculations to show that the universe is actually 14 billion years old. So here we're now getting into some age discussion here. We know the universe is 72% hydrogen, 24% helium, and so here's the thing that you're not told about this though. When the Big Bang was first postulated, when the hypothesis was put forward, there was a prediction about how much hydrogen and how much helium there should be. And it turns out, when they've actually made the observations, there's quite a bit more helium than they expect. And so, normally, at least any student in high school science would be taught about the scientific method. When a hypothesis is put forward, and tests are done, or observations are made, and it contradicts the hypothesis, you really have two options here. You either have to go back, well, either you scrap the hypothesis altogether, and come up with a new hypothesis, or you actually have to change the underlying principles of the hypothesis itself. Neither of those are what happened with the Big Bang. Instead, what they did was just change the actual theory by guessing at an original density that existed back in the early universe so that it got these numbers. So they fudged it out, basically, is what they have done. And actually, you can find that even on Wikipedia. They admitted that it didn't predict what it should have predicted, so they changed their underlying assumption of what they think the universe was like, and now it gives the numbers that they think it should get. Just to make sure that it is showing that the universe is 14 billion years old. So that right there should cause us to doubt. To doubt the underlying, that they're open to any other possibility. Because they're willing to change the theory to make sure that it predicts the number without changing the underlying assumptions. Okay, so this leads to this. And this now, if there's one thing that you're going to take away from this little intro part, it's this, hopefully. Even if you forget all of the stuff about the Big Bang, this is something that I'll be talking about much more with the example portion, which is this theory called uniformitarianism. Now, I don't know if I'm spelling it wrong, or if it's just not even a word, but every time I type it out, it gets underlined with those red, the red squigglies. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. But it's a theory that I've heard of, and I read about it all the time. I just don't know why. Maybe it just didn't find its way into the database. Anyways, this is an underlying assumption that will feed almost every single discussion of the age of the Earth or the age of the universe. Almost every single one. Essentially, it goes like this. It says that we can look out at the natural world right now. We can make an observation. We can say, we see something happening at a certain rate. Whatever that rate is, I don't even care right now. But we see something happening. And if it's happening at that rate now, here's where uniformitarianism comes in, then it's always happened at that rate. And if it's always happened at that rate, then you work your way backwards and you can say it started however many years ago. It's kind of like, imagine that when you walked in here, and I wasn't ambitious enough to do this, but imagine you walked in here and I had a whole pile of gravel, a big pile of, let's say rocks, small rocks. And I had another pile over there. And every 5 minutes I would walk over there and I'd pick up a rock and I'd put it in that pile, the big pile. 5 minutes later I'd go over and get another one and I'd put it in that pile. And if you were to just base your interpretation on what you see me doing, you would understand that every 5 minutes I moved a rock from there to there. And if that pile is enormous, is it valid to assume that I've been here for a very long time doing that? Moving one rock at a time. That would be the assumption. But notice what it also assumes is that that pile started at 0. Because what could have happened was 2 minutes before you walked in the door, I dumped the whole pile there, and then every 5 minutes, I added a rock. See, you don't know what happened in the past, so you can't know what the initial circumstances were. All you can look at is how fast is something changing and make an assumption. And that's what happens in science all the time. They say, here's the rate that something's happening. If it's always happened like that, it must have been happening for billions of years. Or it must have been happening for millions of years. Or even thousands of years. Right? And so that is the idea of uniformitarianism. Now, I will tell you, uniformitarianism is currently controversial. It didn't used to be, though. It actually was very widespread, and it's still very widespread, but there are more and more people questioning it nowadays. And I'll tell you now, actually, I'll skip ahead. This was one of the original people that came up with this idea. He's not the one, but what he said was this: the past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. No powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. No action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle. So what it's saying is, you can only base the past on what we see right now, and we cannot allow the supernatural. Do you see that there? It actually says that. Well, it implies it anyways. We cannot allow the supernatural. We can't allow it as a way of interpreting the natural world. Now, I will have some more quotes later that make this much more obvious that this idea is out there. This is a book that was written in 1830. This is the one that if most, anybody that knows about science, if I were to say uniformitarianism, they would bring up this name, Charles Lyell. He wrote a book called Principles of Geology. It's actually 3 books. And those 3 books there really kind of set the tone for geology and even chemistry in the future. And biology. Because here's the story, remember I told you last time about Charles Darwin and his voyage on the Beagle. The part that I didn't tell you was before he went on that journey, in fact I think it's right at the beginning of his journey, he was given these books. And he read them. And so he read them and understood that uniformitarianism is a valid scientific assumption, and therefore, if you see a change happening in nature, in living things right now, then it's valid to assume that that change has always happened, and the theory of evolution, macroevolution, was born. Okay, and so it came from him, from applying uniformitarianism, which was a geological idea, to biology. All right. Now, I put this passage down on your page here, and I want to read it out because it's kind of interesting. I've been thinking about this one a lot. By the way, this is 2 Peter 3. Remember that passage for with the Lord? A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. This is that passage. This is the verses that come before that. So it says, most importantly, I want to remind you that in the last days scoffers will come, mocking the truth and following their own desires. They will say, what happened to the promise that Jesus is coming again? From before the times of our ancestors, everything has remained the same since the world was first created. Notice what James Hutton also had to say. There was no vestige, I don't know what's in it, of a beginning and no prospect of an end. It is essentially the same thing that is being warned of in 2 Peter there, different context of course, but essentially the same thing. What it's saying is we're getting impatient, we're looking at the present, and we're saying, based on what we see right now, we can rule out any of the claims that have been made about the past. And this has happened in the scientific community where they say, look, we understand, we see these slow geological processes happening now. You tell me that God existed and that He actually made everything. I tell you that I see this happening very slowly, and it's been happening. There's the natural process, and it's always been this way. And in 2 Peter, it's kind of hinting at that, although I'm certain that Peter didn't have this idea of uniformitarianism in mind when he wrote that. And so there it is. And I want to read the rest. It says, they deliberately forget that God made the heavens long ago by the word of His command, and He brought the earth out from the water and surrounded it with water. Then He used the water to destroy the ancient world with a mighty flood. And we can actually also say that scientists that are believing that naturalism is all there is are deliberately forgetting about the past that is laid out in the Bible. Right? That's a deliberate choice that is being made. All right. Now I have a video here. It's not too long. Just in case you don't hear the instructions, all you have to do is there's some basketball players, and I just want you to watch the team that's wearing white and count how many passes they successfully make.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Alright, so here's my point. It's easy to miss something that you're not looking for. And that is certainly true of many scientists nowadays. They are never looking for youthfulness. They are not looking for signs that the earth is young. They are only looking for signs that the earth is old. And so some of the evidence that I will talk about now is really something that should cause some scientists to stop and think for a moment. Say, what does this actually mean? But instead, it will actually cause them to come up with a different interpretation of that evidence. So, let's get into some of the evidence now. Now, I apologize. Being a chemist, I felt that we have to first talk about radiometric dating. Carbon dating is one form of that. Maybe something that you've heard of. And the reason why I feel like we need to talk about that first is because in many of the debates that I've watched or articles that I've read, comments that people have left, is that when the actual evidence is being discussed, and if it seems that the Earth is showing signs of youthfulness, this is the fallback. Radiometric dating is when people come back to and say, but carbon dating says, but uranium, thorium, lead dating says, but blah, blah, blah. And so that is something that I want to talk about to start. What I will do is talk about carbon dating first. I'll explain it in the most detail, and I know I'm not even going to explain the uranium, thorium, and the uranium lead system, but the assumptions that go into carbon dating are the same assumptions that go into the other ones, they just are different contexts. So carbon dating largely deals with things that were once alive, and uranium, thorium, and uranium lead deals with rocks. Okay, now it's the main one that is used for rocks nowadays. All right, now I put this up here just for the high school students in the crowd, because this probably sent some shivers up their spine from grade 9 science class. But my point is this. In fact, let's go to a slightly less scary slide. There we go. My point is this. Carbon, because that's the one I'm going to talk about, carbon is not all the same. We maybe have this idea that when scientists talk about carbon, It's always the same every time. But, I don't know if you've ever looked closely at a periodic table, it's really, you would. You maybe have noticed that the masses on the periodic table are decimals. They're not whole numbers. And the fact that they're decimals actually means that they're averages. The only way you get an average is if something's different. And so you can see what I put up on the slide are 3 different forms of carbon. There's carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14. There are others too. But these 3 are 3 of the main ones. In fact, you can see I've written some words underneath here. Carbon 12 is what most people think of when they hear the word carbon. Most chemists think of when they hear the word carbon. It means it has a mass of 12. How does it get that mass? Ask me later if you like. But it means that it has a mass of 12. And it makes up most of the carbon. Probably 99% of it even. I bet you it's that high. I don't know the exact number. Carbon 13 is a stable form. So carbon 12 is stable, meaning it stays as is. Carbon 13 is another stable form, but it's very rare. Okay, you won't find too many of them. And carbon 14 is even more rare, but it's also unstable. In fact, it's radioactive. So that word maybe has some bad connotations for some people, but all radioactive means is that it actually changes. It breaks down. So it can change even from one element into another. That's what happens when something is radioactive. So carbon 14 is a known radioactive form of carbon. Here's our atmosphere. This will be relevant in a moment, but here's our atmosphere. It's mostly made up of nitrogen, which by the way has a mass of 14, just like carbon 14. Oxygen, and then you've got carbon dioxide, other gases, and water. Carbon dioxide is carbon in the atmosphere mixed in with some oxygen. And so notice it's a very low percentage too. 0.03. That's the percentage of carbon dioxide in the air. But it does have a form in the air. Now, let's go back to carbon 14. Where does carbon 14 come from? It comes from that nitrogen actually. There's 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, especially way up in the higher reaches of the atmosphere as well. And what happens is you get this form of radiation from the sun. The form of radiation called cosmic radiation. It sounds awesome, doesn't it? However, it's really not. It is perhaps the most powerful form of radiation that comes from the sun. And fortunately, it does not reach us here on the surface. Because if it did, you wouldn't be able to go outside. It is that powerful. So when cosmic rays, because it does get into the upper reaches of our atmosphere, when it hits nitrogen, it actually changes it into carbon 14. How does that happen? Ask me later. Okay, it really just involves some electrons, but for now, it happens. Okay, and so that is the only source of carbon 14 on Earth. That's where it comes from. Okay, so there's this small amounts of the nitrogen, get hit by these powerful rays from the sun, and you get carbon 14. Where does carbon 14 go? Since it's radioactive, I told you it will change. So what it actually does, since it's unstable, is it decays naturally back into nitrogen. So it's a very simple cycle. It starts out as nitrogen, gets hit by these rays, turns into carbon 14, and then it will turn back into nitrogen on its own. When it does so, it kicks out an electron. And so that's the process of what carbon 14 undergoes. Now they've actually measured this. This is a well-known phenomenon that when the carbon 14 changes from this to this, that it takes 5,730 years for half of a sample to change back into nitrogen. It's called the half-life. You've maybe heard that word before? It just means half of it's changed. So another 5,730, so let's say you have a sample, 5,730 years, you have half of it gone, another 5,730, and you have only a quarter left. So, if I can just skip ahead, here's the carbon cycle. Now what I have over here is some Legos. I stole from Noah again. And so I have a pile of Legos here. Maybe you can see they're mostly black pieces of Legos. You see that there? But every once in a while, there's a different color mixed in. But let's say this is all carbon, all of it. And this is the air. Okay, so this is in the air. So this is carbon dioxide right now. Now, in grade 9, or actually even in elementary school, students learn about the carbon cycle and how carbon actually finds its way into each one of us. So here it is in the air. Notice Small amounts of it are actually these different colors. Most of it is regular carbon. So the black stuff we call carbon 12, is normal stuff. These are your carbon 14s. Okay? You with me on that? Okay. Over here is, let's say it's a plant. What happens with plants is they absorb carbon dioxide and they use it to make a form of food, sugar, essentially. And in order for me to get carbon inside of myself, I have to either eat plants or I have to eat other animals that also ate plants. Right? So ultimately, plants will be taking this carbon and it becomes part of that. Now the ratios are the same because living things, let's say this is me now, living things like myself are constantly cycling carbon. In fact, because I'm doing an awful lot of talking, I'm probably giving off an awful lot of carbon right now, carbon dioxide, right? And so that I'm constantly have carbon flowing out, actually back into the air. And I did eat supper tonight, and so I took in a whole bunch more carbon. There's other ways I can lose carbon as well, but I don't necessarily feel the need to explain those to you. But the point is, I constantly am cycling carbon. And because I'm constantly cycling it, I match the air. Okay, I'm the same as the air right now. So here I actually think I have 6 in here, 6, and there's 6 in here, 6 of the special carbons. Most of my carbon is carbon 12, small amount is carbon 14. And as long as I'm alive, I'm going to continue to cycle it. I'm going to continue to exchange it. It's not going to be drastically different. The moment I die, though, something changes. I stop taking in new carbon. I don't have that ability anymore once I'm deceased. And so what happens is these carbon 14s I told you, they naturally will break down into nitrogen. And so, over time, right now I have 6 in here, after 5,730 years, half of them are gone. If I take another 5,730 years, we'll say half of them are gone. Another 5,730 years, and another half of them are gone. And eventually, what happens is, a sample can be tested. If we look at the air and we say, we know there should be this much carbon 14 in it, we look at the sample and we say it actually only has this much, they then do some fancy math, which is actually taught at high school, I believe, in terms of the math that's required for this, and figure out how old it was, or at least how long ago it died. Okay, just based on the fact that it's not taking in any new carbon, and that carbon 14 is constantly changing. Now there is a limit though, because as you can imagine, it'll eventually run out of carbon 14. There'll eventually be nothing left. And that limit, they say, is around 100,000 years. So if there's a sample that is any older than 100,000 years, it should not have any carbon 14 left. It should all be gone, because it's all decaying. Okay, so that is the idea of radiometric dating, or at least carbon dating. Now, let's get into the idea. So I told you, the clock is ticking when something dies. When it dies, it can now be, the samples can be taken to test how long ago it actually died, based on how much carbon 14 is left. So, let's look at some of the assumptions then. There are 2 key assumptions that go into this. Just like my example with the rock pile, right, and you didn't know how much was there to begin with, scientists are actually assuming that they know the amount of carbon 14 in the air in the past. Because notice, what is it based on? It's based on how much carbon 14 there is in the air right now. We have no idea how much carbon 14 was in the air when this thing actually died. We just say this is how much is in the air now, so we say that's how much should be in there. So that's an assumption. Another assumption is that the half-life, that 5,730 years, that's never changed. Okay, so that's another assumption. So, let's address these assumptions then. This is known, by the way. It is known that our Earth is a giant magnet. It has magnetic properties that really are allowing us to stay alive here. Because this giant magnet, what it does is it redirects most of those harmful rays from the sun. So this is the solar wind, which is the radiation that comes from the sun. And this is the magnet, these pink lines are the magnetic field lines. They redirect it. So really our magnetic field protects us. It keeps us safe from most of the harmful radiation. Small amounts get in, that small amount hits the nitrogen, turns into carbon 14. Does that kind of make sense? Right? But most of it does not hit us. Here's what they know about our magnetic field. It is decaying. It is weakening. And it's weakening exponentially. So because it's weakening exponentially, in the past it must have been much stronger. We just apply uniformitarianism to that. And we say, if it's getting weaker at a certain rate today, it must have been getting weaker, it must have been this strong back then. The problem is that actually poses a problem for old age, because if the magnetic field was much, much more powerful, then what it actually should have done was blocked out even more of the cosmic rays, which would have meant there would have been less carbon-14 to begin with. Right? Because that's the idea of where the carbon-14 actually came from. And so because of this idea, we have no idea how much carbon-14 was in a sample in the past. We really don't. Okay, here's another one. This is actually known as well. The Industrial Revolution, which was about 150 years ago or so, right around Darwin's time actually, a little bit more. The Industrial Revolution, they've actually recorded that it changed the amount of carbon-12. When a whole bunch of fossil fuels were burnt, it released a whole bunch of carbon dioxide that was all carbon-12. There was no carbon-14 in it. Okay, so it was all carbon-12. And then what that did was increase that amount, and it actually messed up their calculations. So they've actually had to factor that in. So anything in the past that has actually released carbon from the ground, there would be no carbon-14 in the ground. Right? And so that actually messes things up. Volcanic eruptions are known to release significant amounts of carbon, significant. And so because of that, that would change the amount of carbon-12 that's in the air. And here's the thing, from a biblical perspective, there was a beginning. And at that beginning, it's fair to assume, from my worldview, that there was no carbon-14 yet. It was zero. The amount was zero, and as the sun started interacting with the earth, it slowly started building up. And so all of these things combined, all of them, all four of these ideas combined, would lead to the idea that we really actually have no idea how much carbon-14 there was when any sample actually became fossilized. And so it really calls into question that underlying assumption that we know how much was there. Because they're basing it on today, not what it was in the past. Okay, now I want to get into some of the more current stuff, because this is one that I brought up in the first session and it requires more investigation. This was the sample, I'm still talking carbon dating by the way, even though you might not know it. Dr. Mary Schweitzer I brought up, she's the one that actually discovered soft tissues inside dinosaur bones. They discovered it by accident. They had a T-Rex femur that was too big to fit in the vehicle that they were using to transport it, so they broke it, they cut it. And when they actually cut it, they observed these materials that were totally foreign to them in terms of the dinosaur sample. So, this is what she had to say. It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones are, after all, 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? And so you can see this idea of it being soft tissue can be quite confusing for somebody that holds to an old earth. But that's not the point I actually want to make right now. Because there's a bit of a story that goes along with this. And there's all the different players involved, all the different scientific players involved. Because here's what happened when this discovery was made, which I think was 2006, if I'm remembering properly. There are organizations called Creation Ministries and Answers in Genesis. They are young earth organizations. They jumped the gun. As soon as this discovery was made, they said, this is proof, conclusive proof, the earth is young. Well, it wasn't. It's not proof of anything, really. It's just kind of one of those neat things. So I do believe that they were wrong to jump the gun and make that claim. Then there were opponents of Mary Schweitzer to begin with. I already explained to you how she had trouble getting published in journals because of her discovery. But secular scientists actually set out to prove that it was not soft tissue, that it was not authentic, that it was not legit. And so what they said was, no, it's not soft tissue, it's what's called biofilm. Biofilm is just basically leftover remnants of bacteria that would be young. So the bacteria would be on the sample and it would contaminate it. That's what they're claiming. Dr. Schweitzer set out to say, no, I'm pretty sure this is original. She actually got her start in a medical laboratory setting. And so she knew soft tissue when she saw it. And so she said, it is original. but it must have just been preserved for millions of years. So these are all the different stances that people held to when this discovery was made. Here's what actually happened though. That team of secular scientists that was adamant that it was biofilm, they set out to prove that it was biofilm. This is where it gets interesting. What happened was this. They said, let's take a whole bunch of different samples. We'll cut the bones in half. They went around and gathered a whole bunch of different bones. They cut them, they tested them, and they found that, they said, well, there seems to be soft tissue in a lot of these, but it's probably biofilm. And their proof was this. They carbon dated it. They carbon dated the soft tissue, and they found that it was young. It wasn't old. It was giving recent carbon dates in the order of 70,000 years as opposed to 65 million. And so they published their findings. It's in a journal called the PLOS One Journal. And they published it and said, we now know that this is not soft tissue, way too young to be, it must be biofilm. Dr. Schweitzer was not to be done, so she led a team. And what they did was, they went and gathered a whole bunch of samples as well, and they tested them all. And they found soft tissue in over half of the samples that they have. And what they did was they made sure to use the most careful, comprehensive testing methods to eliminate biological contaminants. They used the samples, the procedures that would be used for any other any other substance that needed to be carbon dated. They used the same procedures. Now, it's widely accepted that she was right. It was soft tissue. And so she conclusively showed that it is not biofilm, it is not a contaminant, it's actually something that is original soft tissue. Now what I find is interesting in this is, what about this? I did not find this anywhere else. However, if you think through that story that I just told, remember that secular group. What did they do to conclusively prove that it was not original? They did carbon dating, and they got young dates. And because the dates were young, they said, it must not be soft tissue, that we know dinosaurs are not that young. Dr. Schweitzer conclusively proved, and the scientific community agrees with her right now, that it was original, that it is valid tissue. This has been forgotten about. But to me, that carbon-14 test that those secular scientists did to prove that it wasn't soft tissue, since it was soft tissue, that should make them stop and think for a moment and say, okay, if it is soft tissue, and it did show young ages, put those two together. Now that by itself is kind of a weak argument, so I went digging a little bit more and I wondered, did any other scientists ever run carbon dating tests on dinosaur bones? Here's some data, which because it doesn't actually show up very well there, it's on your sheet. Now I know it's just gobbledygook right now, but here's what it is. A team of scientists from the University of Georgia set out to test dinosaur bones, carbon dated them. They did eight different bones. You can see they did an ilium from an Allosaurus up there. They did a femur from a Ceratops, which is a species, they couldn't identify which species it was from. They did Triceratops, Apatosaurus, Dactylophagosaur, Triceratops, Dactylophagosaur, and an Acrocanthosaurus. But the point being, every single sample that they tested had carbon-14 in it. Every single one. They had ages anywhere from 31,000, 24,000, 33,000, 37,000 years. And so this really caused some stir. If only that was where we left the story out. Unfortunately, this is kind of how it went down. This team of scientists submitted their abstract to be presented in 2012 at an Asia-Oceanic Geosciences Society and an American Geophysical Union collaboration. So you had two major geological organizations getting together for a conference. They were approved. And so at this conference, they actually presented their findings. You can actually go on YouTube and find their original presentation. If you Google carbon-14 and dinosaur bones, you can find it. It's not interesting because it's just not. But he goes through the data and he goes through the presentation, and you can see it was at this conference in 2012. However, here's what happened after the fact. They received a letter that says this, quote, The interpretation which you present in your abstract is that the age of various dinosaurs, previously interpreted as Mesozoic in age, are less than 50,000 years old. You report that these ages were calculated using carbon-14 methods. There is obviously an error in your data. The abstract was apparently not reviewed properly by our staff, and we accepted it in error. For this reason, we have exercised our authority as program chairs and rescinded the abstract. In other words, it's disappeared. It's actually no longer, I've gone onto their website, this union that exists here, and you can actually go to the 2012 conference. You can find the room that it was in, because it tells you on this video that I watched, and it's just, there's a gap. There's just a time slot that's missing. They removed all traces of this presentation on their website. Fortunately, though, the abstract did get out there, because it got out there in terms of the 2,000 scientists that were present at the conference. They all got it. They were all there. So there's at least a few. Now this is a question that still remains, though. If these dinosaurs are supposedly 65 million years old, how could they possibly have carbon-14 in them? They couldn't. Remember I told you, the upper limit is 100,000 years. This is substantially younger. And in fact, these ages here, for reasons that I already explained, are higher than what they probably, the bones actually are, because of the weakening in the magnetic field, because of the initial circumstances not being known. And so we would actually end up with less carbon-14 back then, which would give an appearance of older samples. Now I'll tell you this, how do they figure out the age of a dinosaur bone if they don't carbon date it? They don't. Nobody, prior to this team, no scientist had ever carbon dated a dinosaur bone before, because it was assumed that they were 65 million years old and therefore should not have carbon-14 in it. And so this had never been tested before. This team did it and found this data to be what their discovery was. There's been one other instance. It's a team in Sweden, I think it was Sweden, somewhere up there, and they actually had a sample that they tested the age of. They did a carbon test. They found that it was within the same range of ages as these, but they immediately questioned their own methods, because they're like, this isn't right. Even though they had followed the procedures, because this is a team, they don't actually usually test dinosaur bones. They are looking for mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and those types of things, which those existed within the range that carbon dating would still be valid. And so they didn't realize they were testing a dinosaur bone. Tested it and said, we must have messed up. And that was the end of that rabbit trail. And so that is kind of the story here. But I put a challenge up to you young people up there. For any of you, if you're taking the sciences, this is an unexplored avenue. If you want to make a name for yourself, this would be a way to pursue an area of thinking that nobody or not many have pursued before. All right, I want to just quickly talk about this, because this is totally speculation at this point, which I think I said in the handout. But to add to this idea that dinosaurs are young, if that's the case, then they must have coexisted with humans. They must have. Which, if you suggest that, nowadays you will be laughed at. Maybe some of you are laughing at me right now, I don't know. But there are a few examples of art that really call into question what maybe some humans saw. This is a carving from Colombia? Yeah, this is a carving from a temple in Colombia, and it seems to be something that's awfully reminiscent of the Stegosaurus. Now, is it definitely one? No, I don't know. I don't know what it is. But it certainly appears to be something that doesn't match any other species that is known right now. And so unless these ancient people had incredible imaginations, incredibly accurate imaginations, or if they were actually better paleontologists than the people that are working right now, this is pretty remarkable to be able to put together a representation like that. Here's another one. It's maybe not showing up too well. This is actually from the... Oh yeah, by the way, that temple is actually not that ancient, now that I'm remembering. It's from the 1200s. Okay, so that temple in Colombia. This is another one. It's from a tomb of Bishop Bell. And it's two things that, again, what are they? I actually don't know. But they sure seem reminiscent of an Apatosaurus or a Brontosaurus, as you might know it. Here's another one. These are two examples of ancient legends from Australia, from Aborigines. And these are the descriptions that have been put forward by these people. Again, it's totally speculative here, but these are the descriptions that have been described there. They kind of look like two types of known dinosaurs. And then, of course, there's this, which this one's fascinating. This is it's in Utah, and this is, it certainly looks like a brontosaurus, an apatosaurus of some sort. But here's what I found in terms of how it's being explained. It is being said that what you actually have here is a cave drawing of a snake with a mud spot below it. That's the way it's being described right now on the Smithsonian website, as well as, what's the other source? I forget. But that's how that is being described. Now, it's been analyzed by experts, and experts suggest that this is one continuous picture, at least experts that would agree that humans probably coexisted with dinosaurs. So this is totally a worldview dividing issue right now. All right, moving on. I'll go quicker for these next ones, so if we're getting a little anxious, it'll go faster here. Okay, rapid fossilization. I've seen some of these kinds of pictures put forward on the internet as examples of showing that fossils can form incredibly rapidly. Well, I agree. I agree fossils can form rapidly. The issue with things like these is that they're untested. This right here is actually a souvenir that is sold in the UK, and this teddy bear is fully petrified. It's rock, but it formed in 2 weeks. And they just put all these teddy bears in the river. It's a highly mineralized water source, and it's a souvenir. It's a gimmick to get people to go there. Now the danger with this is that it's not a fossil. It is what's called a concretion, where what you have is these minerals entering around the original material and then forming rocks around it. It is not replacing the original material. A fossil is actually, there is none of the original material left. This is the secular definition. There's none of the original material left. It is fully turned into stone, right, through a process of mineral transfer. So that's the way fossils are defined. Now, this one here, same kind of thing. It is likely, now I don't know, I haven't seen tests on it, but this one is also likely a concretion. It is likely rocks are in between the original material. This one is a little bit more interesting, because this one, even scientists that wouldn't hold to a young Earth suggest that this one here is probably partially fossilized, but it's never been tested. And so it is it's not accessible to scientists that would care to test it right now. And so as a result, it's not been tested, and so people just kind of dismiss it. However, it's probably partially fossilized. But here's what they say. They say because it's partially fossilized, this is, by the way, a cowboy boot with part of a leg in it, human. And they say that this is partially fossilized, which shows it's not old, it's young. But then I ask, what about all of those dinosaur bones that they're finding partially fossilized? They also are young? Is that what they would say? Well, not likely. So, here's another instances of rapid fossilization. I'll just go through them quickly here. You find remarkable fossils of fish and other species. There's some sort of horse-like species that are fully intact, essentially, before they fossilize. In weird and wonderful poses, even. So here is a fish eating a fish. That's what you're looking at. And another one. And I think I have another one. And so these are pretty, like they're capturing a moment here of predator-prey. There's another one here of an ichthyosaur giving birth. That's what you're looking at. You can see the baby right here. And I believe there's another one. Oh, this is the interpretation of that. And so these are prehistoric dolphin-type creatures that have live birth. And so what this suggests, I have some more actually, this is another interesting one. What this suggests is that the process of fossilization is not well understood. For something to be able to fossilize very, very, and to stay in those poses would be fairly rare, I suppose. And yet they're finding more and more and more of these fossils. And this one I put up the other week. This is a really neat one. It's a Protoceratops locked in combat. with a velociraptor, basically. Here is the actual fossil. You can see the velociraptor here, there's the Protoceratops. And so what's actually being said about this one, though, is to reinterpret it. They're saying that what this is proof is that velociraptors were scavengers and it was eating this Protoceratops and then it died. Right? So that's what they say this is showing. However, what can be seen, maybe it's not seen too well here, but it is seen here in this artist's representation, is this thing that it was scavenging on fought back. It actually has the arm of the velociraptor in its mouth, and the velociraptor's arm is broken, actually. So this was a fight that has been captured. Here is the new interpretation, right? Notice, first of all, what's different about the velociraptor from last week. You notice the feathers there. That's all about. I went too far ahead. And this is now a close-up of the fossil. You can see the broken forearm here. That's its claw. It was broken from the velociraptor. And so what this really calls into question is the process of fossilization. What has largely been put forward in the past is this. Something dies, it sits there, it slowly gets covered up, and eventually becomes fossilized. That is actually what's put forward because these fossils are found in rock layers that are said to represent vast amounts of time. Instead, what seems to be the case, and by the way, if you've ever seen any sort of aquatic creature, it's not likely to sit on the bottom perfectly like that. It'll spend some time up here. It'll also likely be scavenged. And it's not going to be perfectly fossilized. Certainly not in the pose of giving birth, or eating another fish, or fighting Velociraptor and Protoceratops. So all this suggests is that this process of fossilization is not as well understood as people claim. In fact, here's the criteria for something to become a fossil. It has to first be buried in a high water content environment. Then it has to be a low water content environment after that. And so, to me, a biblical flood would certainly produce many of these fossils, and the rate of sedimentation would be so rapid that things would be buried and captured in these poses that are otherwise unexplainable. And so the process of fossilization is perhaps different than what many have suggested. Now I have more to say, but I'm going to not say it. Let's talk about erosion, because we have to switch gears a little bit here. Erosion is one of those things that is quite interesting if you want to talk about age of the Earth. I will be applying uniformitarianism to the phenomenon that's observed right now, and it will actually show not age, but youth. Now, this is one case here where there's a cliff in Beachy Head, which makes me think of Bodie McBoatface. You guys know what I'm talking about? That's just a weird name. In the UK, and what happened at this cliff, there's actually a known erosion rate 1 meter every 6 years. That's how far inland this is going. And so if the cliffs are as old as they say they are, 65 million years old, then if you apply uniformitarianism to that, to what they're saying, that means that there's 10 million meters, or 10,000 kilometers of erosion inland. Now that number, I mean, I don't even know how wide North America is, but I'm pretty sure it's not quite 10,000 kilometers wide at its widest point. And so this is suggesting that these cliffs in the UK eroded more than North America's width in the time that it's existed. Well, that's not consistent with any sort of science that's put out there right now. Now here's a more compelling argument. There are these things called river basins, which geology is outside of my area of expertise, but I've had to look into this a little bit. And a river basin is essentially the catchment area for a river, right? So we actually live in the St. Lawrence River Basin, so whenever it rains, did it rain already? I can't see outside. No, it didn't rain? Okay. Yes. It did? All right. So the storm that we just had, that water it'll hit the ground, and it will eventually drain into streams, creeks, into the Conestoga River, and then that river will feed into wherever it goes. I have no idea. Likely end up in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes feed into the St. Lawrence. The St. Lawrence feeds it out into the ocean. And so all of this land around us feeds into the St. Lawrence. When rain falls, what it does is it erodes a little bit of soil, a little bit of the land. And that soil, that sediment, will eventually find its way out into the ocean. I'm not saying that the soil from Creighton is in the ocean already. It certainly isn't like that. But what they have done is they've actually tested various rivers and found out what is the rate of sediment loss. How much land is lost out of the mouth of each river into the ocean. And so you can see some of these numbers up here. They've done studies, and they found that on average, the river basins around the world, on average, lose 6 centimeters every 1,000 years. Some of them can lose up to 1 whole meter every 1,000 years. Now, that doesn't sound like very much. I mean, in 1,000 years, it's only 6 centimeters. That's because it's not very much. Let me show you a picture. This is the different river basins. This is us. We didn't even make, look at it, number 5. There we are, right there. So, I picked a couple here from the data that's been tabulated. I picked one that's low, and I picked 2 in the middle, and I picked one that's high. This is not the lowest river, but nor do I have the highest river up there. I just picked a representative sample. The Nile erodes 13 millimeters every 1,000 years. That's not much, by the way. 1.3 centimeters is it in 1,000 years. The Tigris River erodes 260 millimeters, or 26 centimeters in 1,000 years. The Ganges erodes 56 centimeters. And this, I don't even know, the Huang erodes 90 centimeters in 1,000 years. Now those don't sound like big numbers because they're not. However, there's a big question that goes along with that. Because this is how old the continents are said to be. The continents are said to be 2.5 billion years old. So if we apply uniformitarianism, and even if we apply it generously, then what we get is this. The Nile, oh yes, by the way, those numbers, the sediment numbers that they're saying, those are heights. So it's saying that the land has dropped by 6 centimeters every 1,000 years. That's what they're saying. So the Nile basin has lost 32.5 kilometers of height in 2.5 billion years. The Tigris has lost 650 kilometers of height. The Ganges has lost 1,400 kilometers, and the Huang has lost 2,250 kilometers of height. That's how much height has been lost. Now, the Earth's crust is only 30 to 50 kilometers thick. So if you looked at those numbers, you should maybe realize that the rates of erosion that we're seeing in terms of the height loss far greater than the land that we see. Now surely I'm not the first person to have thought of this, because I'm not. And so an old Earth person, somebody that holds to an old Earth, would argue that the land uplifts, it makes new land at the same rate. And so because it's making new land and the rate's dropping at whatever rates they are, it stays relatively constant. And that's why we still have continents. Because otherwise, based on this data, the continents should just be gone. We shouldn't even have land to stand on. And so that's a pretty good answer, except for the fact that they've radiometrically dated the continents. And under their old age numbers, they actually have shown that the continents are old, not young. So let me go back for a minute and we'll look at this one here. How about this one? The Tigris has lost 650 kilometers of vertical height in the 2.5 billion years. Now, if there's new rock being made, then what should happen is all the surface stuff should be gone. New rock should be made, old stuff's gone, new stuff's made, old stuff's gone, new stuff's made. If you were to test that and find out how old it was, it should be young. It should not be 2.5 billion years old. Because the old rock's gone. The sedimentation rate has removed the top layers. It should be new rock. And yet what happens when they radiometrically date it is they find that it's the same age, all the continents are all the same age. And so that's a huge problem in terms of uniformitarianism and old Earth. We do not have enough crust to account for the rates of erosion that have occurred, and the theory of new rock being made can be ruled out by radiometric dating. Now, I already explained to you that radiometric dating has flaws, but what it can still do is tell you an average. It tells you how things relate to each other. It could say this is older than this. It can do that. It just can't put a number on it. And so if it's telling you that all the continents are the same age, then they're all the same age. A better answer is that the continents are actually young, and they've only been eroding for 6,000 or 7,000 years. In which case, the numbers that I showed you are not very much at all. And that would actually be consistent with the fact that we're able to stand here and do this presentation right now. All right, another interesting story. Maybe some of you have heard of this before. This is called Glacier Girl, which was a World War II bomber. Actually, I think it was a fighter, but I'm no plane expert. What happened was there was a squadron called the Lost Squadron in World War II that ended up having to do an emergency landing in Greenland. It landed on some ice. The crew and everything were rescued a few days later, but they had to leave the planes behind. And so these planes have been there. There's been kind of these stories tossed around over all these years that, well, somebody should go and get these planes. You know, it's a great opportunity to find these World War II relics. And so eventually some people decided to go and do it. Obviously they had some money. And they went out to find these planes. And the assumption was that they were just going to have to brush off some ice off the wings. It had been about 50 years, I think, at this point, maybe 60 years. And so that was the assumption. When they got there, they couldn't find them at first. It took them a long, long time to find these planes. When they found them, they were actually 250 feet below the ice. They were in the exact same formation as when they landed, because some have argued they just sunk through the ice. Well, if they sunk into the ice, they would not have stayed in the exact same position. However, they did move sideways, which ice does that. Glaciers do that, and so they were pushed sideways. Ice moves uniformly, so they were pushed sideways. And they've been confounded. They have since removed them. They've removed one of the planes, and they did it with hot water, and obviously a lot of money, in order to get these planes up from 250 feet below the level. Not only that, here's the kicker, because I've read before that people look at the ice layers and they say there's layers in the ice. If you take a core of a sample of ice and count the layers, they say each of those represents a year. Well, the ice above this plane represented far more than 50 or 60 years. It was just the layers. So instead of saying that each layer represents a year, what it really should represent is where it melted and froze, melted and froze, melted and froze, which can happen many times in a year. And so they have this ice building up above this plane. They have many, 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 many layers building up. And it shows that even ice buildup happens at a vastly different rate than what has been understood. So, I'm not going to explain these, but I tossed them up there because these are the options that I had in terms of things I was going to talk about tonight. Mount St. Helens has some really fascinating geological features that defy uniformitarian assumptions. It actually shows rock layers that are said to have formed over millions of years, but Mount St. Helens formed it in a day when it erupted. Salt levels in the oceans, the level of salt that's in there and the rate that it's getting saltier calls into question the age of the Earth. Comets, they tested comets, they lose mass. And at the rate that comets lose mass, they shouldn't exist anymore at the age of the solar system. They shouldn't be there. And so they invented a new place in outer space called the Oort cloud, which I've taught to my students, accepting authority that there's evidence for this place, and I've now discovered there is no evidence for the Oort cloud. It's invented to explain why we still have comets, because really, we shouldn't. Helium levels in rock, that's an interesting one, but it's very technical. Recession of the moon. The moon is slowly moving away from the Earth, very, very slowly, and the rates that that's happening should really cause some old Earthers to question what's going on. And then there's carbon-14, which has not only been found in dinosaur bones, it's also been found in coal, oil, and diamonds. Those processes to produce those are said to take more than 100,000 years, and so as a result, by natural circumstances, and so as a result, that should cause some question as well. By the way, just to wrap up the radiometric dating, there is a project happening right now. It's called the RATE project, where they're really calling into question that the rates have stayed the same. Because that's the assumption. The carbon-14 has always decayed at 5,730. But now there are scientists kind of asking themselves, maybe that's changed. Maybe that hasn't always been the same. All right. So, in conclusion, does it even matter? I've given you some evidence here for what I consider a young Earth. Does it mean I'm right? I don't know. How could it? I have no idea. Does it mean that I'm wrong? Maybe. I have no idea. But does it matter? I say yes, it does. And not necessarily the age, but it certainly matters to trying to understand science from a Christian perspective. Because I say yes, it does matter. So I want to give you some reasons why. Now, what do I have? There we go. The first thing that we talked about tonight was the universe. And I suggest that the age of the universe might be the least important topic of all the things that I've talked about in the last 3 sessions. I would say the age of the earth is perhaps a little bit more important. But for now, let me just answer this question. So what I say is that I know that God exists. I know He's real. And I also know that He has the power and the ability to make everything in an instant even. He didn't even need 6 days. He chose to do it over 6 days, and that's in His wisdom that occurred. An atheist, or somebody that is naturalistic, would say that my position is completely irrational, and that I must be stupid because I hold to it. We have scientific laws that are put forward that suggest that the world did not require a creator, that it just exists from random chance. That God can't exist because of the laws of science that prove Him to be unnecessary. That's what's been suggested. So let's examine more of what an atheist would say. An atheist would say that the universe came into existence from a singularity. That's what's up there. And that singularity was a point that had no volume, had infinite density, somehow contained all of the raw materials in the universe. See, the problem with that is that in order for the Big Bang to have happened, that singularity must have always existed. And that defies the current laws of physics. And so although people say that it is completely irrational to believe in God because He defies the laws of physics, the Big Bang Theory defies the laws of physics. At some point, the laws of physics break down. So it's actually more rational to believe in God, who created the laws of physics and can operate outside of them, than to believe that randomly somehow it just happened outside of the laws of physics. I believe that God made the universe and everything in it. He also made all life. So where did that life come from? Well, if you can recall last time we talked about the number of genetic information that's required to make one cell reproduce itself. 473 genes, or 351,000 base pairs of instructions. So I believe that it's God's created work that life came from. Those instructions did not come from nowhere. And I believe that that is a more rational